The Icon 2.5 VS remote reservoir coilovers are some of the impressive pieces of hardware in Icon's arsenal of suspension components, and are just the thing your F150 needs to handle the most extreme off-road applications. These Icon coilovers provide your tough truck with greatly improved response, compression, and rebound, all while providing a staggering reduction in fade and heat buildup during even the most violent, sustained, and consistent suspension articulation. These coilovers don't just improve suspension performance, they can also provide your truck with up to 3 inches of front lift to allow you to squeeze on impressively sized wheel and tire combinations. We start by taking off the front wheels to have complete access to our front suspension. For even more room to work, we remove the dust shield from the fender liner and set it aside. Moving from the top coilover mount and working down the side of the suspension, remove all the brake lines and vacuum lines from their clips in the frame to allow slack in the system. Pry off the axle dust cover next so you can remove the axle nut from the spindle. We then worked on removing the outer tie rod nut. Under the lower control arm, remove the 2 lower shock nuts to prepare for the coilover removal. 09 to 13 F150s have a single bolt through the lower control arm, and 14 to 18 trucks have 2. At the top of the knuckle, you will find the upper control arm mount, which can be loosened all the way to the end of the threads. After removing the screws that hold on the brake lines to the knuckle and frame, and removing the vent tube from the axle, grab a hammer and break loose the outer tie rod from the knuckle, as well as the upper control arm. Before removing the UCA from the knuckle, slightly loosen the back 2 control arm mounts to release tension from the UCA. The sway bar is next up, and remove only the top nut from the end link to slide the sway bar up and off. We next remove the 3 upper shock nuts from the coilover so it is ready for removal. Then take the UCA out of the knuckle and swing it up and out of the way of the coilover. With the axle out of the knuckle, the coilover can be lifted out. Insert the Icon coilover in its place and loosely attach the top hardware. The axle can then be slid into the knuckle and the lower shock mount bolted into the lower control arm. Next, the vent tube can be reattached to the knuckle, which can then be swung back up and attached to the upper control arm. We also upgraded our upper control arm at this time, as you can see here. Now that the axle is in place, carefully tighten down the axle nut, but do not over-tighten and snap the axle threads. After the axle nut, torque down the upper control arm nut back to the knuckle. Our new upper control arm uses a castle nut. Next up, the top coilover bolts can be torqued down to the strut tower as well as the rear upper control arm mounts. Bolt up the brake line brackets back to the frame and knuckle in addition to the push clips that were routed alongside them. We can reattach our sway bar to the end link and bolt it down as well. Then after that, replace the tie rod back into the knuckle and torque it down. In order to mount the shock reservoirs, find the spot in the frame between the body mount and the coilover to drill the mounting hole into the frame of the truck. Loosely attach the band clamps that hold the reservoir to the bracket, then bolt up the bracket to the truck. Then you can tighten down the band clamps to the reservoir. All that is left to replace is the dust cover and wheels to finish the installation. And with that, here is Noah, the owner of the Overland build, with his overview of these Icon coilovers.
With this truck, we did Icon suspension on all four corners. We've got the, it's gonna be hard to see, we've definitely been putting them to work, but we do have the Icon 2.0 rear shocks with the reservoir, piggyback reservoir on them in the rear. And then at the front, we went ahead and did the Icon 2.5 coilovers with the remote reservoir as well. So the coilover is tucked up straight in there, and then the reservoir mounts up in the front of your fender, back in there. And that basically is a little bit beefier setup on the front than the rear, but it does allow a bit of adjustability. We have them at around 2¼ inches of height, so that gets the truck nice and level, a bit of extra clearance, especially with a blockier mud terrain tire. And it also allows us some space to articulate and move the wheels and really get this thing out off-road and obviously collect dirt the way we've done. Coming up, doing about 2.5 hours of highway time, the Icons do really well on the street. Plenty happy with the performance. Not too stiff or bouncy for anybody that's been paying attention to this build from when it was stock. It actually had factory suspension, but had a 2.5-inch spacer in the front, which really kind of stiffened up the ride even more and made it pretty uncomfortable. So swapping over to a full coilover setup like the Icons was a nice change for that. Eats up the bumps a little more. Blunt hits into like speed bumps and things are a lot less aggressive. You don't feel it through your spine. I definitely was happy with it on the road. Running it out here, it's been really solid. The Icon suspension is pretty good at taking the heavy hits. People looking for ultra plush squishy suspension like in a big SoCal style pre-runner build probably aren't going to be blown away by it, but when you hit the bigger bumps at high speed it definitely shows its strengths. Managing the washboard and stuff like this is pretty excellent. You definitely maintain good ground contact, keeping the tires planted. Traction feels a lot better. So definitely a good step up from running the factory suspension with a spacer on it. Really gets the truck a more planted feel. You definitely don't get the idea that you're going to rattle anything apart. After coming back from the Flagstaff trip, spending some time up in the woods and running around the cinders and really beating the truck around a bit and getting a feel for it, I'm really happy with how the Icon suspension performed. They took a lot of abuse, hitting things at whoops and rocks and all sorts of divots at 60 to 70 miles an hour in some cases. I definitely took the hits, didn't feel like I was abusing the truck or like anything was going to break or shatter. Road driving wise, getting up there was also really smooth. Definitely acceptable for an everyday commuter kind of build, driving back and forth to work or drive your kids to school and not feel like the truck is too uncomfortable or too stiff to be enjoyable. The overall suspension setup on this truck from a 0 to 10 scale, 7 or 8, it's definitely a great suspension. I've been super happy with it, using it as a daily driver and using it to go camping, off-roading, whatever it may be. Very comfortable and certainly a big upgrade over the factory suspension with that spacer in there. Pretty rigid, so this was a welcome change. I do think that there may be some other slightly softer suspensions on the market that could offer a little bit more cush at lower speeds and make you a touch more comfortable, but there's a lot of comfort in that the Icons can take the hits when you're going high speed, or if you come across a divot or a rock you weren't expecting, it'll take those all in stride.